Welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to do something really fascinating, essentially an archaeological excavation of the 1920s home. You know, as a social historian, I've always believed that to truly understand a civilization, you can't just look at its rulers or big political events. You've got to look at the domestic frontier. We need to look right at the mortar, the plaster, the stoves, and the floorboards. So, together, we're going to reconstruct an entire human world just by looking at the everyday experiences of ordinary people and see how geography, technology, and social hierarchy completely structured their existence. So, this brings us to a really profound historical question. What was life actually like behind the closed doors of the Roaring Twenties? To answer that, we have to step completely out of our romanticized modern assumptions about the era. We need to immerse ourselves in the actual sensory reality of urban living a century ago. What did it smell like? What did it sound like? What exact constraints dictated the daily choices of just ordinary citizens trying to navigate the sheer mechanics of survival? The divide we have to cross here is stark. On one side, you've got the Gatsby myth, right? The illusion of endless glamour, flappers, speakeasies, the whole shebang. But on the other side lies the gritty, physical, and socioeconomic reality. We're talking grueling domestic labor, strictly segregated tenements, and, believe it or not, toxic early refrigerators that could literally poison a family in their sleep. Today, we're going to completely dismantle those historical illusions by diving into the hard evidence of material culture and demographic records. Section 1. The Urban Housing Frontier, the Post-WWI Boom. Right after World War I, this massive wave of industrial migration created an absolutely desperate demand for housing in American cities. And the 1920 census marked a really critical demographic tipping point, 51.2%. For the very first time in American history, the majority of the population actually lived in urban areas. This sudden, massive concentration of humanity literally forced cities to change their geometry. Hemmed in by skyrocketing land prices, they couldn't just build outward anymore. They had to build upward. So the multifamily dwelling, which had previously just been dismissed as a tenement for the poor, was rapidly rebranded into the modern apartment house. Section 2. Stratification and segregation, the divided city. Now, this new vertical world was deeply, deeply divided by geography, wealth, and race. Looking at the 1920s economy and adjusting for modern inflation, the disparities are just staggering. Down at the bottom, marginalized immigrants lived in old law tenements for about $25 to $50 a month. To put that into perspective, that's roughly $440 to $880 today. These were cramped 300-square-foot spaces, communal toilets, cold water only. In the middle, white-collar professionals paid up to $100 for private baths and steam heat. And at the top, wealthy elites were paying $400 or more, over $7,000 today, for sprawling suites with dumbwaiters and servants' quarters. But wealth wasn't the only barrier. The very architecture of the city was weaponized to exclude, and systemic discrimination fundamentally shaped daily life. While affluent white populations enjoyed these newly built, beautiful garden apartments in enclaves like Jackson Heights and Queens, those communities often enforced strict race-restrictive covenants that legally barred Black, Jewish, and immigrant buyers. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, African American and Asian residents in cities like San Francisco were structurally confined to rapidly deteriorating subdivided Victorians and these dark, subterranean units in districts like the Western Addition and Chinatown. Section 3. Engineering the compact home, maximizing minimum space. To understand how landlords maximize their profits while still complying with strict new public health codes, we really have to look at the buildings themselves. Pre-1930s apartment exteriors featured this heavy, load-bearing masonry and hand-finished plaster. But more importantly, their internal design was heavily dictated by the threat of disease. The Tenement House Act of 1901 was this massive public health revolution aimed at combating tuberculosis. It completely outlawed those old, dark, windowless interior rooms, and it mandated that architects include air shafts and interior light wells to make sure natural light and ventilation reached every single living space. However, as landlords added those light wells, the actual square footage inside the apartments shrank dramatically. In Washington, D.C., for example, average units fell from 4 rooms to just 3 over the course of the decade. This crunch forced some ingenious spatial engineering, most famously, the Murphy bed. Invented around 1918, this pivot and counterbalance mechanism allowed a full-sized bed to just fold right up into a wall recess. It completely redefined the boundaries of privacy and domestic space. Suddenly, a respectable daytime parlor could instantly transform into a bedroom at night. But this dense, compact living birthed a pretty overwhelming acoustic reality. Try to envision the sensory experience of existing in this space.
Surrounded by thin walls in quickly built multifamily buildings, like the ones on Seattle's Capitol Hill, tenants reported hearing absolutely everything. Creaky lath and plaster ceilings transmitted every single footstep from above. Shared plumbing conduits functioned almost like acoustic megaphones, broadcasting the rush of water and neighbors' intimate conversations straight into a living room. And outside your door, the public hallways echoed endlessly with the constant, heavy traffic of urban life.
Section 4. The perilous modern kitchen. Dangerous automation. The modern kitchen was defined by a really volatile transition from grueling manual labor to highly dangerous automation. I think we often harbor this assumption that early appliances were just, quaint and charming. But the reality? They were profound chemical hazards. Early electric refrigeration didn't use Freon. It relied on highly toxic gases like ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide. Imagine waking up to the pungent burning smell of sulfur from a leaky compressor unit right in your kitchen. It was a potentially lethal hazard that, astonishingly, cost a family up to 25% of their average annual income just to acquire. And integrating these new technologies into older buildings resulted in a chaotic, totally makeshift reality. Early electrical systems were designed exclusively for ceiling illumination. Baseboard outlets, those were an extreme rarity. So when a household purchased a remarkably expensive new $38 Hoover vacuum or, say, an $8 waffle maker, they were forced to screw these precarious socket adapters directly into their ceiling light fixtures. Cords would just dangle haphazardly across the room just to power these new modern conveniences. Section 5. The paradox of labor saving, the servantless home. Let's zoom into the most intimate level of the home, the human body. The daily reality for the 1920s housewife was absolutely exhausting. As historian Ruth Schwartz Cowan notes, the average housewife post-World War I managed more machines than she did people. See, prior to the war, many middle-class urban households relied pretty heavily on live-in domestic servants. But strict 1924 immigration quotas and a booming industrial economy provided working-class women with much better factory and clerical jobs. This abrupt shift created the servantless home, transferring the grueling physical burden of domestic labor entirely onto the middle-class woman of the house. Driven by the new science of domestic sanitation, standards of cleanliness became agonizingly meticulous. Just consider this strict, scientifically managed daily regimen. At 7:30 a.m., windows are opened to create a stack effect for cross-ventilation. By 7:35, clutter is cleared and cushions are plumped. At 8 a.m., a formal hot breakfast is served. And throughout the day, dishes are washed 3 separate times, and floors are continuously dust-mopped. The cruel paradox here is that these new labor-saving devices didn't actually save time. They just demanded vastly higher standards of hygiene that kept women working longer, much more arduous hours. Now, to mitigate this immense physical toll, architects engineered built-in infrastructure, features they marketed as silent servants. This included the installation of glass or aluminum-lined laundry chutes, which spared housewives the grueling labor of hauling wet, heavy clothing down flights of basement stairs. You had manual and electric dumbwaiters hoisting up heavy groceries and coal. They even had double-sided cast-iron receivers built right into the exterior walls, allowing milkmen to securely leave deliveries without the resident ever having to interact with them, preserving both her time and her privacy. As we conclude our explainer and this excavation of the 1920s apartment, we're left with a lingering question. We've seen how these so-called labor-saving technologies of the 1920s actually intensified the physical and psychological demands of daily life and fundamentally altered the architecture of the home. So, if that was true a century ago, how are our modern conveniences, our smartphones, our smart homes, our constant connectivity, reshaping the spaces, the boundaries, and the anxieties of our world today? What does it truly mean to live a modern life? Because when we examine the mortar and the floorboards of the past, we inevitably find a mirror reflecting our own condition. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration.